Hey guys, in tonight's story, I'll tell you why Pharaoh Akhenaten slept with his hidden maid every night. I know you've worked a lot today and feel quite tired now. You just want to relax with a cool, calm story that gently lulls you to sleep. And before your pillow swallows you whole, please press the subscribe button and write the exact time and place in the comments while this boring story slowly helps you drift off over the next 10 minutes. Now pull your blanket up. Some secrets prefer to be heard in warmth. Let's begin. She is the maid of Pharaoh, and she never made noise when she walked. The limestone floors of the palace could whisper back the sound of every footstep, every sandal brushing softly past a painted wall. But Kiya's steps were always quiet, not just careful, practiced, like someone used to not being noticed, even when she was supposed to be. Kiya was not the queen, not even close. Nefertiti's statues still stood tall in the courtyards, her name carved again and again across lintels and columns. She was called the Great Wife, the Beautiful One, the royal consort who prayed to the Aten with her husband side by side. But Kiya didn't have statues. Only a handful of inscriptions remain. One of them simply says, "The wife, beloved of the great king." That was it. Beloved, but never loudly. You wouldn't find Kiya in the public court. She didn't lead ceremonies or hold lotus blossoms for the gods. You would, however, find her in the back corridors of the palace at Akhetaten, just before sunset, when the kitchen fires went quiet and the last of the scribes rolled up their scrolls. She would walk silently through the long, plastered halls, always toward the king's rooms. She wasn't sneaking. There was nothing illegal about her being there. Pharaohs had many wives, and Akhenaten was no exception. But it wasn't her status that made her interesting. It was how close she became, without anyone ever quite noticing. No one wrote songs about Kiya. No temple hymn carries her name. But if you follow the layers of bureaucracy, you find her. She had a house of her own, near the edge of the royal compound. Servants were assigned to her, not many, just enough to comb her hair and help her with the soft linen robes that needed folding. Her name appears in one place, on a shattered alabaster jar, found near the pharaoh's bedchamber. Not much more than a whisper. And yet she was there every night. When the sky over the Nile turned a pale pink and the heat sank into the stones, she would rise from her sitting mat. She didn't wear gold ornaments like Nefertiti, no jingling earrings or anklets. She walked like a breeze. A servant might light a small oil lamp and then quickly turn away, never meeting her eyes. No one announced her. There was no ceremony, but the guards at the chamber door never stopped her. Akhenaten, by all accounts, was a man of odd habits. He built a new city in the desert, far from the priests of Amun and their endless temple demands. He worshipped only the Aten, the sun disk, and called himself its prophet. His palace at Akhetaten was designed not like the old Theban structures, but open, full of air, corridors leading nowhere, sunlight bouncing off pale white walls. And even within those walls, with all their brightness and order, he carved out darkness, rooms without windows, a sleeping chamber so still and silent it felt like a tomb. That's where Kiya went. No servants entered. No scribes recorded what was said. But when the sun rose again, she walked back, just as quiet, and no one asked her what she had seen. She may have borne him a child. Some scholars believe a princess named Bakataten may have been hers. There's an image on a wall in one of the north palaces, a young girl holding her father's hand, while another woman, maybe Kiya, stands beside him. The carving was later chipped away, deliberately, as if someone decided it was better not to remember. This was not the world of romantic love as we think of it. Royal marriage was duty, status, political alignment. But Kiya, she seems to have been chosen differently, not loudly, not for ceremony, quietly in the evening, without record. We don't know what they spoke about, or if they spoke at all. But night after night, Kia's shadow passed the same guards, stepped across the same tiles, and disappeared behind the same veil. She knew her place, not the one written into the formal scrolls or declared at feasts, but the one chosen in silence, confirmed in the steady rhythm of footsteps and doors that closed softly behind her. When Akhenaten's world began to unravel, when enemies rose, when Nefertiti's name disappeared and reappeared in strange places, when sickness crept into the court like dust through a crack, Kiya remained invisible. Or rather, she remained exactly as she always had been, slightly present, slightly not, a figure who walked when no one else did. And maybe that was what made her so enduring. History forgot her, but the palace remembered. Every time the evening came and the servants cleared the corridors, there was a sound that didn't echo. A woman's step, soft as linen brushing past polished stone. A voice not written down. A life not sung about, but known every night. And as the palace darkened, as even the oil lamps turned to faint flickers, and the halls fell quiet once more, she walked on. Her sandals left no mark. Now close your eyes. Picture the desert moonlight resting softly on the limestone path. The palace is asleep. Even the Pharaoh has stopped speaking to the sun for the day. And somewhere in the stillness, a quiet figure passes through the corridor, never seen, never heard, but always there. There was something about Akhenaten at dusk. The city, built fresh from the dry bones of the desert, had none of the old noise of Thebes. It didn't carry centuries of chants or the footsteps of 100 kings. It was young, still finding its voice. And in that hush, as the last streaks of light pulled away from the pale, mud-brick walls, the city seemed to hold its breath. Kiya knew that breath. Her house stood at the edge of the royal compound. Not far, but not central either. Close enough to be summoned quickly, far enough to be forgotten in the day's affairs. There were tamarisk trees in the courtyard, a stone bench where she sometimes sat with her maid, combing out her long dark hair, but mostly she stayed inside, waiting. When the servants brought water, it was always cool. When they brought fruit, it was always dates. She never asked for anything else. Even her clothing reflected that quiet. The linen she wore was unbleached, soft and simple. Sometimes, if she was called to attend a small ritual, she might wear a faint touch of myrrh behind her ear, or a slender gold ring that never seemed to catch the light. But on most days, and every night, she wore only silence. There were no records of her speaking before the court, no declarations, no petitions, no official correspondence. Her name never appeared on the city stele, the tall stone markers etched with praises to the Aten. Even her title was uncertain. Some inscriptions call her the king's beloved wife, while others simply name her the favored one. And then for a long time, her name vanishes entirely. But within the palace, people noticed her absence more than her presence. On the rare nights she did not pass through the corridor, the guards at the eastern wing would exchange quiet glances. The servant with the folded robe would pause by the door, unsure whether to lay it across the couch. The oil lamp would burn slightly longer before being pinched out. They never asked questions, not out loud, but everyone knew when the footsteps didn't come. And they knew what followed those nights. Sometimes the Pharaoh's mood would shift. He would speak to the Aten with more intensity, longer prayers, more pauses. He would forget his meals or dismiss the singers before the fourth song. And then, without explanation, Kiya would return. always softly, always with her hands clasped at her front, her eyes lowered, her voice nearly inaudible when she greeted the guards. Akhenaten was known for his eccentricities. He spoke of light not as a god, but as a being with fingers reaching into every crevice of the world. He made his priests into scribes. He closed the great temples. But in the private moments, those without sunlight, he seemed to become something else. Not a prophet, not a king, just a man who waited for someone to appear. Kiya didn't have the beauty of Nefertiti or the glory of foreign princesses who arrived with dowries and scented scrolls. But she had presence, or perhaps the opposite. She had absence refined. She knew how to walk behind columns and never draw attention, how to sit without shifting her robe, how to listen. And perhaps that was what Akhenaten needed. The city he built was filled with bright walls, open courtyards, shining columns meant to reflect the disk of the Aten. But brightness gets tiring after a while. So much light becomes loud. And maybe in that hush he needed someone who didn't reflect it, someone who absorbed it, gently, quietly. There are records of her attending one banquet, just one, a feast honoring a royal daughter's birth. She sat at the far end of the table, hands folded, head slightly tilted. The inscription notes her presence with the words, "Beloved, seated in silence." That's how history recorded her, in silence, but she wasn't entirely gone. The North Palace, long abandoned and broken by time, held a painting once. On the far wall of the inner chamber, a scene was drawn in careful lines. A woman hands a young girl a lotus flower. Their faces are tender, soft, different from the stiff forms usually carved for royalty. Some believe that woman was Kiya. The painting is gone now, lost to sun and sand and the slow collapse of the house. But the plaster fragment bearing her nose, just the curve of it, was found years later by archaeologists, dusty and dull, half buried in rubble. It wasn't much, but it was something. You see, in royal Egypt, memory was sacred. To be remembered was to live forever. But Kiya lived in a different kind of memory, not the kind chiseled in stone or sung by temple choirs, but the kind passed through gestures, through glances, through quiet footsteps echoing down a hallway after dusk. She was never powerful, never grand, but she was known. In the shadows, in the moments just before sleep. And maybe, just maybe that was enough. So now, as you lie there, picture that narrow corridor again. White walls, a simple lamp hung on a peg, the smell of oil and dust and faint perfume, a quiet footfall, then another, and then nothing at all. Let the room grow still. Let the light fade from your thoughts. There's no need to open the door. She's already passed, and all that remains is the hush she left behind. It is difficult to trace exactly when Kiya disappeared. No grand announcement was ever made. No funerary monument was built in her name. There was no ceremony, no painted tomb. Her name simply stopped appearing. One day it was inked softly in the back corner of a list, linens for the wife, Kiya. And then, not long after, not at all. Her rooms were reassigned, the quiet servants sent to other corners of the compound, the oil lamps removed. The tamarisk trees still stood, but the stone bench grew dusty from neglect. People didn't speak of her, not because they feared her, but because she had always been slightly invisible, even when she was present. To mention her felt like disturbing something delicate, like brushing away cobwebs that had hung for too long without trouble. Some believed she had died of a fever. Illnesses came and went quickly in the desert air, and the royal court had little time for mourning lesser wives. Others said she had been sent away, to a quiet house near the edge of the Nile, far from Akhenaten, with servants enough to live, but not enough to remember her. But there is one theory, softly held, quietly studied, that suggests something different. In a hidden chamber beneath the floor of a lesser shrine to the Aten, a fragment of a statue was found. It was small, unfinished. The features had been started but not completed. But near the base the words still clung to the stone. The beloved of the Lord of Light. There was no name, but it didn't need one. What mattered was the affection, recorded not in volume, but in gentleness. Akhenaten lived strangely. He moved cities, rejected gods. He stared into the sun as if it might speak back, but even he, with all his divine claims and royal proclamations, seemed to need something human, something ordinary, something small and unspoken. Kiya was that presence. In a court full of noise, priests chanting, scribes scratching, builders pounding, she offered stillness. In a palace bursting with images and inscriptions, she offered the comfort of being unnamed, of being known only by the pattern of her step and the warmth she brought at the end of the day. And perhaps, when Akhenaten closed his eyes at night, when the sun disk dipped below the edge of the hills, and even the god of light had gone to rest, it was not prayers that calmed him. It was the sound of footsteps, faint but familiar, followed by the whisper of linen brushing stone. Even when she was gone, the rhythm remained. He walked the corridors more often, stood longer in doorways, stared quietly into rooms, as if waiting for someone to reappear. But no footsteps came. In time, the city itself vanished. After Akhenaten's death, his successors abandoned Akhenaten. The temples crumbled, the palaces sank into dust, the desert took back its quiet. Nefertiti disappeared from the records. The Aten shrines were defaced, and the name of Akhenaten was scratched out of history in many places, as though the sun had never shone on him. And yet, here we are, still speaking his name and hers, because history has a way of letting the quiet ones return. Not loudly, not through fame, but through fragments, through soft patterns, through silence that insists on being heard. So if you listen closely now, very closely, you might still hear her. Not in the words carved into stone or the papyrus scrolls of priests, but in the long, dry wind that moves down the halls of ruined palaces, in the hush of linen falling to the floor, in the slow, steady steps of someone who knew how to love invisibly. Kiya was never crowned. She was never mourned in public, but she stayed in the folds of the king's nights, a quiet shape behind the curtain, a hand that smoothed the fabric on the bed, a breath in the dark, and maybe that's all any of us can hope for, to be remembered even a little by the shape we leave behind when the door closes. Now drift a little deeper. The palace has gone quiet. The sun has finished its song. The corridor is empty, but the stillness lingers like a warm trace on a stone floor. Let your thoughts settle. Let the footsteps fade and sleep. She never spoke in full sentences. Just a nod, a bow, the soft pat of her bare feet as she moved across the polished floors. Every night before the last light left the palace walls, she was summoned. Not loudly, not by name, but by ritual. A clay bowl, a scent of lotus, and the waiting skin of a tired king. She wasn't born to this job. Her name isn't recorded in any scroll, but she was chosen, in her youth, from the linen servants in the lower halls. Not for her beauty, though she had it, not for her strength, but for her silence. You see, in Akhenaten's court, stillness was its own kind of power. The pharaoh prayed often, spoke to the Aten for hours in long open courtyards, but at night, after the chants faded and the scribes retired, his body ached. His limbs were long, and his back bent strangely. As many images of him show, he suffered quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, from pain. And so every night a girl was called. She arrived with her eyes lowered, holding a bowl of warm oil with both hands. The oil was pressed earlier that day from blue lotus and bitter almond. It was thick, fragrant, but not sweet. The heat from the bowl rose gently, and the scent curled up with it. She did not speak. No one taught her what to say because she wasn't expected to say anything, only to kneel at the foot of the great couch where the pharaoh reclined, only to dip her fingers into the oil and press them against skin, slowly, respectfully, but firmly. Every joint was touched, ankles, toes, arches worn thin from standing too long at ceremonies. The pharaoh closed his eyes, not to sleep, not yet, but to forget the long daylight. It wasn't passion. It wasn't even personal. It was something older, something ritual. The maid knew the pattern by heart. Start with the left heel, always. Press gently, then circle the bone with her thumb, then the outer edge of the foot, and finally each toe, one by one. She had been trained by another maid, long since gone. The same way one priest trains another in the rhythm of a hymn. This was not flirtation, it was duty. And yet, she knew things the queen did not. She knew which ankle flinched when pressed too hard. She knew the stretch of skin just above the heel that stayed warm longer than the rest. She knew how long to wait before adding more oil, and when not to. Some nights, Akhenaten murmured, not words, just fragments, half-thoughts, names of cities, of daughters, sometimes even of gods long forbidden. But the maid never reacted. There was power in pretending not to hear. She never sat on the couch. Her knees bore the imprint of the same tile every night. Her dress, plain white linen, carried the scent of the oil even in the morning. She would return to the servant quarters while the sky was still dark, before the kitchen stirred, before anyone noticed she had gone. Her fingers remained fragrant for hours afterward. In the servant halls, the other girls knew what she did. Some pitied her. Others envied the quiet closeness. None dared speak of it. Sometimes an older maid would say gently, "Your hands will forget the feel of your own skin." But the girl said nothing back. She just tucked her bowl away in the reed cabinet and folded her sleeping mat. Once, during a dust storm, the pharaoh did not call for her. She sat in the corner of her small room that night, bowl ready, oil still warm, but no one came. The guards stood still. The doors stayed shut, and for the first time in many nights, her fingers stayed dry. She did not sleep. The next night, the summons returned, quietly, without explanation, as if nothing had changed, and again she walked the corridor, turned left at the lotus basin, passed the stone lion statue, and entered. This time the pharaoh's eyes were already closed. She pressed her palms together before beginning, the way the old maid had shown her. Not out of worship, but out of habit. And maybe that was the difference. Worship asked for something. Habit gave without question. Night after night, season after season, she came, while the city rose and faded, while the queen made appearances and then vanished from the records, while even the Aten's name was carved and then erased. She continued her task, and in that long forgetting, she became a part of the palace that no one thought to describe. She left no child, no tomb, no statue, only a faint trace of oil, perhaps, deep in the grooves of the couch leg, a scent trapped in stone, a memory in the floor. You see, not all stories are carried by scrolls. Some live in joints, in repetition, in skin and scent and silent rooms. And some, like hers, are not stories at all, just soft movements, repeated so many times that even history cannot fully erase them. So now, as your breathing slows and your eyelids grow heavier, imagine her again, kneeling at the base of a golden couch, in a room where even the lamps do not flicker, her bowl warm, her hands steady, no words spoken, just oil and silence. The routine became part of the palace itself. Every evening, as the light softened and the air cooled slightly, the scent of heated lotus oil would drift through the service halls. The bowls, prepared before sunset, were warmed in simple clay stands over a charcoal flame. It wasn't a royal preparation, not in the way the queen's perfumes were blended. Those had myrrh from Punt and resin stored in alabaster. This was simpler, domestic. Thick oil, slow burning, dark in color. The maid didn't choose the ingredients, but over time, she adjusted the heating just slightly, keeping it from becoming too hot, too fragrant, too sharp. She learned that warmth mattered more than scent, that fingers could move more softly when the oil held its heat. No one taught her these things. There were no instructions, no scrolls to consult, no priests of ointment. She just learned by listening, listening with her hands. The pharaoh never acknowledged her presence beyond a soft glance, or rarely, the movement of his feet to allow her closer reach. He didn't speak of her, didn't name her in public, didn't mark her in any record, but he did not stop her. And that was enough. There was something private in pain. Many believed Akhenaten's body was not like other men's, his limbs long and uneven, his belly rounded, his chest oddly soft. Some say he suffered from Marfan syndrome or other disorders. We don't know for certain. What we do know is that he spent long hours standing, walking, bowing toward the Aten, and that each night his feet ached. That's what she was there for. Not love, not power, just that pain, that simple, quiet ache at the end of a long, ceremonial day. She sometimes heard his breath slow, not sleep, but something near it, that shallow rhythm that comes when the mind has stepped just outside itself and the body is allowed to be real for a while. That's when her hands moved slower, less pressing, more smoothing. A rhythm meant not to fix, but to release. There were other nights, too. Nights when he clenched his toes slightly, when his muscles tensed, when his breath stopped and started again with a strange stutter. And in those moments, she paused, waited, let the oil warm her fingers again before touching his skin. You see, it was not just a task anymore. It had become knowing, quiet knowing. One night, during the season when the river retreated and the winds dried the mud into crackling tiles, a second servant entered. A young girl, new to the palace, carrying another oil bowl. She stepped into the room with hesitant grace, her eyes wide, unsure of where to stand. The older maid, the one we know, remained still. She looked once toward the pharaoh. He didn't move. Then, softly, she reached out, took the second bowl, and without a word, guided the younger girl back to the door. A glance, a small bow, and the door closed. After that, no other hands touched the pharaoh's feet. Some say that moment was when she became something else, no longer just a maid, not quite a mistress, something more private, a habit so deeply trusted that to alter it would disrupt the very breath of the room. But she never moved closer, never sat beside him, never asked for anything. Even her own sleep was humble. A narrow mat of reeds rolled out in the corner of the servant's wing. She slept near the oil jars, near the clay bowls, near the racks where linen was hung to dry. Some nights she would wake before dawn with the scent still clinging to her hands. The other servants, over time, stopped asking questions. They understood, or at least they accepted. In the palace, some things were spoken of only through glances. One time a royal physician passed her in the corridor, an older man with a soft, slow step. He looked down at her hands, paused, and said, not unkindly, "Your fingers do more good than my herbs." She nodded once. There was no pride in her, no ambition, but in that quiet acknowledgement, something small had been honored. And so she continued. Through the years, through changes in court, through whispers of war in the north and unrest among the priests, she kept coming. Her footsteps never changed. Her posture never wavered. Her bowl never shook. Even when the Pharaoh grew thin, when his spine curved more, when his days grew quieter and his prayers less frequent, she came. One evening, she noticed he had not moved for some time. His eyes were open but distant, his arms limp beside him. She paused at his foot, her hand hovering, unsure. Then slowly he blinked once. A signal. Nothing more. But enough. She dipped her fingers back into the bowl. The oil was warm, and the silence remained. Now, take a slow breath. Picture her again, kneeling in a chamber where time seems to wait. Her hands steady, her thoughts still, a bowl of quiet oil between her palms, and the soft, weightless task of easing a king's body toward rest. There are no names here, no titles, just rhythm, just skin, just memory. And now, your breath matches hers. Let it settle. Let the night deepen. And sleep. The last time she entered the Pharaoh's chamber, the oil was cooler than usual. Not cold, but less warm than it had always been. The coals in the brazier had taken longer to catch that night, and the clay bowl hadn't sat long enough above the heat. But she didn't ask for it to be reheated. She simply held the bowl with both hands, as she had done for years, and walked the corridor. Her fingers adjusted, they always did. The guards stepped aside without a word. The great door was open, and then shut behind her. The room inside was dimmer than it used to be. Only one lamp burned now, instead of three. The thick scent of incense no longer floated in the corners. Even the Pharaoh's bed had changed slightly. New cushions, perhaps, or just older ones rearranged by different hands. She knelt as always, but the silence felt different. Not heavier, not sad, just final. The Pharaoh was older now, his face thinner, his gaze distant, but his feet, those familiar worn, weathered feet, rested in the same place, angled slightly toward the south wall. She knew every curve, every pressure point. She knew where the skin had grown rough and where it still held softness. She did not rush. Tonight she allowed the cool oil to warm slowly on his skin. No words were exchanged. There never had been, not really. She had spoken more to the oil than to the king. But in that silence, over the course of years, something deeper had formed. A shared understanding without form. A routine not made of rules, but of breath and bone and patience. And on this final night, that understanding held. She worked slowly, tenderly. Her thumbs followed the old path. Heel, outer edge, arch, toe. Then again on the other side. His body did not flinch. It did not shift. but she saw the corners of his mouth soften slightly. He was ready. When she finished, she sat back slightly. Not far, just enough to fold her hands and bow her head. Her fingers still shone with the thin glaze of oil. She waited, not for a word, just for the moment to end on its own. And when it did, she rose. The bowl was lighter now. Most of the oil had been used. The lamp flickered gently, casting her long shadow across the painted floor. She turned once before leaving, not to look at him, but to remember the space. Then, without sound, she slipped through the door. That was the last night she was summoned. The next evening, the oil bowl sat unused. In the servant quarters, no one said anything, but they noticed. The girl, no longer so young now, stood beside the fire but did not reach for the bowl. The warm scent still lingered in the room like memory. The pharaoh passed days later. His death was not sudden. It was not violent. But it arrived quietly, like her footsteps had for all those years. She was not invited to the funeral rites. She did not expect to be. Another girl, younger and full of questions, asked her once what she would do now. She smiled slightly, then reached into the reed cabinet, pulled out the cleaned clay bowl, and placed it gently on the shelf. "I will let my hands rest," she said. The only words the girl ever heard from her. Some say she remained in the palace for a while longer, folding linen, heating oil for other duties, but eventually she faded from the halls, like the scent she had carried for so long. There are no monuments for her, no carved names, no stories sung, but there is a single bowl, found years later, buried beneath the corners of the old servant quarters. Faint traces of hardened oil still clung to its edge, a soft smell, half memory, half dust, and nearby, on the wall, a handprint, small, feminine, pressed in wet plaster, forgotten beneath layers of wash and repair. Some archaeologist might call it a mark of the builder, but others, those who listen a little longer, might say it belonged to her. To the maid, whose hands shaped a nightly ritual without ever being seen. Now, as you lie here in the soft hush of your own room, imagine the scent of blue lotus on warm skin. Imagine the flicker of one lamp, the weight of a bowl in gentle hands, and the patient care of someone who asked for nothing, except to be allowed to ease another's pain. One last time. Let your thoughts go quiet. Let the footsteps grow faint. Let the oil cool slowly. And sleep. She slept in soft linen beneath a smooth ceiling painted with blue stars, but each night a curtain hung between her and the man she called husband. A woven wall of ritual, not cloth, a symbol, a boundary, a silence thicker than any royal decree. Nefertiti was not just a queen. She was the great royal wife, the visible partner to Pharaoh Akhenaten, the woman whose face was carved into limestone with more care than most gods. She stood beside him in prayers to the Aten, lifting her hands to the sun disk, her tall crown reaching toward heaven. By day, she was worshipped. But by night, she lived behind a curtain. Not a curtain of shame, not exile. No, this was tradition, an embroidered divider that split the royal bedchamber in two. Not every queen had one, but in Akhenaten's strange and sacred palace at Akhetaten, where the sun reigned above all, this quiet wall was part of the design. You see, the pharaoh followed light, and light, as it was believed, must not see what should remain hidden. The curtain was gold and red, dyed with rare pigments imported from distant lands. It was heavy, woven by temple women who never met the queen. They worked in silence, tying knots with fingers that did not know whom they served, but the result was soft, thick, and hung from a rod carved to resemble lotus stems. Behind that curtain, Nefertiti rested on a raised couch. Her attendants, 5 women who had once been dancers, now stilled by palace rules, stood near until the lamps were dimmed. Then they withdrew, slowly, one by one, leaving the queen to her silence. She did not speak after the lamps were turned down. That was her custom. Not a single word, not even to herself once the final oil wick was pinched. Her thoughts were hers alone then. She would lie back, head against embroidered cushions, and wait, not for sleep, but for the sound. Because every night, almost at the same hour, she heard the steps, not from within her chamber, but beyond the curtain in the outer hall. Soft footfalls, bare feet usually, sometimes accompanied by the faint clink of a bowl. A servant, perhaps, or not a servant. The curtain fluttered slightly, not from wind, but from movement. She never rose to look. It was not her place. She was not a jealous wife. That wasn't the role of a queen. Her purpose was appearance, stability, ritual. She was the kingdom's face. Her beauty was political, her posture sacred. If she cried, and surely sometimes she must have, she did so quietly, under linen, while the scent of incense faded in the dark. Some nights the curtain was still. Those nights Akhenaten lay on his couch longer, stirred restlessly, whispered words she could not hear, perhaps prayers, perhaps regrets. On those nights she could almost feel the air shift, but most nights he left. He did not pass through her curtain. He did not call her name. But the wall of cloth felt his absence more than it ever felt his presence. This too was ritual. He belonged to the Aten by day, and at night it seemed to someone else, or perhaps to no one, just to silence, to walking, to escaping the bedchamber's formality. The curtain never moved. It simply hung, heavy and obedient. And Nefertiti lay still. The temple women told stories, long ago, of queens who walked through their own curtains, who took steps not allowed, who crossed invisible lines to demand answers. But Nefertiti never did. She understood the weight of performance. Her face appeared on temple walls, her arms lifted toward the sun disk in flawless gestures. Her neck was long, her gaze calm. She had 6 daughters, each trained to walk precisely as she walked, to hold fruit and fans and scrolls with the same measured grace. Crossing the curtain would ruin that grace, so she didn't, even when she suspected, even when the priestesses gossiped, even when the maid who folded her robes came late one morning, eyes red, hands trembling. Nefertiti asked nothing, said nothing. Behind the curtain she became something ancient, like the walls themselves, still, ornate, silent. The curtain, over time, grew heavier, not literally, but in presence, in feeling, in the way it divided not just space, but memory. Nefertiti aged behind that curtain, not visibly at first. Her paintings stayed the same. The palace artists reused her face, carving the same features into new stone. But her real body, the one behind the wall, grew tired. Her shoulders sank just slightly. Her hands became still for longer periods. The sharpness in her gaze softened. She began to dream more often. Dreams of open courtyards, of being young again, of running through cool halls barefoot, before the temple robes, before the titles, of brushing the curtain aside without thinking, just to breathe the outer air. But she never did. Even in dreams, she stayed behind the cloth. And then one night the steps stopped. Not once, not twice, but for many nights. No footsteps, no faint scent of oil, no bowl carried across the stone floor. Silence. The attendants noticed first. They fanned her slightly longer, as if to say, "He's still gone." She nodded gently, accepted it. That was the last season of her silence. One morning the curtain was taken down, folded carefully by palace hands, not removed with ceremony, just lifted, folded, and carried away. No one said why, but those who passed her chamber that day said the queen was sitting upright, eyes open, hands resting on her lap, and the empty space where the curtain had hung remained. She didn't move toward it. She simply looked, as if waiting for something, or perhaps remembering, or perhaps finally sleeping, but with her eyes wide open. Now lie back a little deeper. Imagine the soft hush of a room divided not by stone, but by fabric, a gentle curtain swaying in air, too still to move. One side filled with ritual, the other with silence. Let your thoughts stay behind the curtain tonight. No need to cross. Just breathe and sleep. Nefertiti rose before sunrise. She always had, long before the curtain was taken down. The act of rising itself was part of the palace rhythm, a kind of ritual, though never spoken of as such. She did not stretch or sigh. She did not reach for help. She simply sat upright, waited for the stillness to finish settling around her, and then placed her feet gently on the floor. The stone was always cool. The curtain was gone now. That thick divider, its folds once full of gold thread and foreign dye, had vanished without mention. No priest had declared it retired. No servant had whispered of its absence. But it no longer hung in the room, and that changed everything. And nothing. Her bed still rested in its place. Her linen still bore the faint trace of lavender oil, pressed into the fibers by a careful maid. Her sandals were placed by the foot of her couch, just as before. And yet there was more air now. The emptiness where the curtain had once floated gave the room a strange echo. Silence had shape now. It moved. She found herself listening for things she'd trained herself not to notice. Footsteps outside the doorway, the lift of a guard's breath, the brush of reed sandals against polished stone. There was nothing. And so she stood. Each morning began the same. Her attendants entered in perfect order. One to fan the air gently, one to fold her sleep robe, another to present the day's ornaments in a long wooden tray. They moved quietly, but now their steps felt more exposed. Without the curtain there was no sense of boundary, no gentle shroud to contain sound. The room had opened, but not outward. It had opened inward. She sometimes stared toward the spot where the cloth had hung, remembering the weight it carried. Not just fabric, but distance, ceremony, the whole idea that some things were never to be crossed. That had suited her once. Now it felt different. She began to notice things in her room she had ignored for years. A hairline crack in the painted ceiling where the blue stars had faded just slightly. The edge of a stone basin that had chipped during the last flooding season. A wall carving near her bed. A falcon unfinished, its beak oddly curved, as if the sculptor had lost interest. These things had always been there, but now she saw them. It was as if the curtain had not only hidden her from others, but hidden her from herself. The priests still called her name during sunrise prayers. They still carved her image into temple walls, though less often now. Her daughters were grown, 2 of them now presented as royal women, their own faces painted into murals with practiced beauty. Nefertiti watched quietly as her features were passed down, made permanent in stone. But in the evenings, when the lamps were lit low and the palace grew still, she sat longer near the window. She rarely slept right away anymore, not because she couldn't, but because there was something in the stillness, now unbound by cloth, that asked her to remain awake a little longer. One night, while the wind whispered just enough to rattle a palm frond near her chamber wall, she remembered something. It was a moment long buried, a time before marriage, before the palace. She had been no older than 14. Her father, a priest, had been instructing her in the rules of silence. He had told her very carefully, "The gods listen more when you say less." At the time, she had not understood. Now she did. The curtain had been her silence, her offering, her sacred division. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was time the gods heard something else. She began to speak again after dark. Only once the lamps were dimmed and the last attendant had left. Just soft words, to herself, to the still air. She did not ask questions. She did not confess. She simply spoke, small, drifting thoughts like, "I wonder if the river still sings at night," or "The bowl they brought today smelled of sandalwood again." And once, "I miss the color red." There was no one to hear her, but the room listened. And the act itself, like lighting incense or combing hair, became part of her new routine. She didn't move to another room. She didn't invite anyone in. But the space had changed, and she let herself change with it. Sometimes, in the deep hours before dawn, she imagined standing where the curtain had once hung, just standing there, her hands at her sides, facing outward, toward nothing, not crossing, just remembering. The queen had not grown cold in age, only quieter. Her strength had softened into stillness. Her silence had ripened into presence. She didn't need to be seen to be powerful anymore. She simply was. That was the gift the curtain had given her, and the gift its absence left behind. Now, breathe softly. You've walked through no door, and yet the space around you feels more open. You are lying beneath a sky of faded stars. A queen has risen and sat again. The curtain has fallen. The silence is now yours. Stay just like this. The room is listening. And sleep. One morning, long after the curtain had disappeared, and the wind no longer rustled the hanging threads, Nefertiti asked her attendants to leave her dressing room early. It was not a command exactly, just a soft request, spoken with the kind of voice that allowed no debate. They bowed, quietly gathered their linen trays, and withdrew. No one asked why. She sat alone, watching the thin sunlight creep across the floor. It used to stop at the curtain. Now it reached all the way to her sandals. The chamber had not changed much. The floor was still lined with sandstone tiles worn down in the middle. The high walls still bore painted flowers, though time had faded their color. Her sleeping couch remained against the northern wall, its legs carved like lion paws. The air still smelled faintly of cedar, carried in from the garden walkway by the breeze. But something was different in her. She no longer carried the heaviness of performance. She no longer folded herself into silence for the sake of ritual. Her gestures remained elegant, but they no longer belonged to anyone but her. The palace painters noticed first. They began to ask less often to sketch her. The face they had once copied into temples had changed too subtly to follow. It had softened. Not aged, softened. She didn't speak as often at court. When she did, her words were gentle, carefully spaced, full of breath and pause. When priests asked for her opinion, she offered only a look. When daughters came with questions, She answered with a story, often one they'd never heard before. Stories of when she was not yet a queen, of when her feet were dusty and she had no crown to steady on her head. One night, as twilight blurred the line between day and dark, she walked to the edge of the sleeping chamber barefoot. She stopped at the exact place where the curtain once hung. She did not cross it. There was nothing to cross anymore. No barrier, no wall. But her feet paused anyway, as if the memory itself had left a faint warmth on the floor. Her fingers reached toward the air. She remembered how the threads used to feel, heavy, smooth, slightly cool from the night breeze. They would swing gently if you brushed past too fast. But she never had. She had never touched them without need. Now there was nothing to touch. Still, she let her hand rest there a moment, held just above the place the fabric would have been, not to mourn it, but to honor it. And then she turned, walked back to the couch, lay down, and let her eyes fall shut. In another part of the palace, someone lit a lamp. Another girl turned down another bed. Somewhere, sandals shuffled across a hall. But here, in the quiet corner where curtains no longer hung, Nefertiti rested. Not as a queen, not as a symbol, but as a woman who had carried silence well and had now set it down. She did not vanish from history. Her face still lives on in carved busts and museum halls. Her crown is still copied in costume and in stone. Her image, regal, perfect, timeless, still greets visitors who do not know she once whispered to herself in the dark. But now you do. You've seen her not just behind the curtain, but beyond it. You've walked her chamber's quiet floor. You've watched the sunlight reach her sandals. And now, as your breath grows softer, as your thoughts slow to a hush, let the curtain fall again, not to divide, but to protect your rest. Let it hang gently, not between you and the world, but around you like a soft breath. You are not waiting anymore. The quiet has arrived. Let it wrap you and sleep. It was just a single sandal, worn, small, and slightly bent at the edge. But when the guards saw it resting near the pharaoh's doorway at dawn, they said nothing. Their eyes moved once, then back to stillness. That's how silence survives in royal halls. In Akhenaten, the wind moved differently. It didn't howl like it did in the desert's outer ridges, nor did it sing like it did through temple columns. In the palace corridors, the wind softened. It slid along painted walls, stirred linen curtains, and passed between columns where guards stood like carved pillars themselves. You would not hear much, but if you listened closely, you might hear footsteps. Not marching ones, not loud or swift. Just the careful kind. The kind of footsteps that knew when to pause, when to press softly, when to retreat without sound. Those belonged to the night servants, and among them there was one who walked with a slight limp. You wouldn't know unless you watched carefully, but the guards at the outer courtyard saw it often, how she stepped lightly with one foot and slower with the other. It made a rhythm in the dark. She wasn't a royal figure, not a priestess, nor a favorite, nor even a name that lingered in song. But she came to the pharaoh's chamber, not every night, not on any fixed schedule, but often enough that the guards noticed. And one morning, as Ra's first light dusted the palace floor, a single sandal was left by the door. The guards on either side of the entrance, two brothers born of a long line of soldier servants, saw it at the same time. They did not blink. The sandal was simple, leather strap, slight crack on the heel. Not the kind worn by queens, not the sort embroidered with gold thread. It was the kind a woman might wear when walking fast through quiet corridors, hoping not to be seen. But now it was seen. One of the brothers glanced at the other. That was enough. They would not speak of it. In palace training, they had learned a rule, one not written on scrolls, but taught in the space between lessons. Eyes forward, ears open, mouths closed. That rule served them well. So when the Pharaoh's door remained closed for longer than usual that morning, and when the servant with the incense did not arrive until midday, they still said nothing. Only when the chamber doors opened and the woman stepped out, barefoot, did the air shift slightly. She didn't look at the guards. She simply bent, picked up her sandal, and walked away. Not fast, not slow, just with the rhythm she always had. Her limp was more noticeable now. Maybe she'd walked too far. Maybe she had stayed longer than expected. The brothers resumed their post. The door shut again. Nothing had happened. That's how silence works in places like Akhenaten. It smooths over wrinkles. It hides footsteps behind shadows. It takes a sandal left in plain view and folds it into fog. Inside the Pharaoh's chamber, no signs remained. The floor was freshly swept, the linen straightened, a bowl of fruit untouched. The sandal had left no imprint, no trace of dust. But the Pharaoh's eyes, it was said later that day, looked more tired than usual. Not strained, not red, just tired. He spoke less at prayer. His words to the Aten felt slower. One priest said the phrases faltered slightly, but no one corrected the Pharaoh. Later that week, a young guard, newly assigned to the rear passage, asked one of the brothers if the Pharaoh was well. The older brother did not answer. He simply adjusted his spear, looked straight ahead, and said softly, "Some sandals are not meant to be worn in daylight." And that was that. The girl, the one with the uneven steps, did not return for some time. Or perhaps she did, and the guards stopped seeing her. There were whispers, of course, among the lower kitchens, among the bath attendants, quiet comments about who came and went after nightfall. But none of it made its way into scrolls. Not because the events were shameful, but because they were unspoken. You see, in a palace ruled by sunlight, night becomes its own kingdom, and in that kingdom some rules bend, not for love, not for scandal, just for being, for the simple act of walking quietly through darkness with nothing but one sandal on, and another resting beside a door. Now, let your breath soften. You are not in the corridor. You are near the threshold, where sandals wait and stories slip into shadow. Let the air grow still. Let silence press gently against your thoughts. And sleep. The girl's name was not recorded. Not in the palace rosters, not in temple offerings, not in the tidy inventories kept by scribes who sat cross-legged with reed pens and sour ink. But that didn't mean she was unknown. Some knew her by her steps. Others by the way she carried water, always with both hands, never spilling a drop. She was quiet, patient, and smaller than most. Her voice had the rough softness of someone who had not used it much in years. She had come from a family of reed cutters, far from Akhenaten before the city was even finished. Her mother had sent her north to join the laborers when she was only 12. But small hands did not suit brickwork, so they gave her tasks of silence, polishing stone, brushing floors, bringing folded linen through side passages. That was how she ended up near the Pharaoh's quarters, not through invitation, through quiet. And she remained there not through rank, but because she never asked anything, never dropped anything, and never looked up too long when others passed by. She understood the rhythm of the palace, when to walk, when to wait, when to disappear into the corners. But the Pharaoh noticed her, not suddenly, gradually, the way a breeze notices a hanging flower, the way water knows where to settle. He saw her once bringing a cooled basin into a side room. She stepped carefully, holding the bronze bowl to her chest like a sleeping child. She did not bow. She did not speak. She only placed it down, adjusted its position slightly, and left. That was the first time. The second time she brought fruit slices, mango, dates, 2 figs split carefully in half. She did not peel them. That was not her role, but she arranged them into a simple circle, the way her grandmother once had. He noticed that too. No one told her to bring the plate again. But she did. Once a week, always in silence, always placed on the small, low table near the western window, not where guests sat, just where the Pharaoh sometimes read. And in this gentle routine, she became part of his chamber without ever being part of his court. It was many weeks before she stayed longer than a few moments. He didn't speak to her, not directly, but he allowed her to stay as he walked the room, hands behind his back, voice murmuring half prayers to the Aten. And eventually one night she remained behind after placing the plate. She sat on the floor, not out of disrespect, but because it was the most invisible place to sit. And he did not ask her to leave. That was how it began. Not as romance, not as command, but as co-presence. She began to come after sunset, always after prayers had ended, always with something in her hands, a linen cloth, a carved box of balm, a small pot of cool water with lemon peel floating inside. She never brought sandals into the room. They were left just outside, always together, until one night one was left behind. The brothers at the door, now accustomed to her rhythm, said nothing. But later, in the still hour just before dawn, one of them leaned closer to the wall and pressed his thumb lightly to the stone. Not to leave a mark, but to remember a moment. The girl was seen less after that. Some said she had been sent to the outer gardens to tend the young palms. Others said she had been moved to the queen's residence to help with scrolls. But no one said she was dismissed. There was no punishment, no whispers of disgrace. Just silence. Because in that palace, silence was the final servant. One day, a high priest from Heliopolis visited and commented on the peace of the Pharaoh's chamber. He said the room felt recently rearranged. No one corrected him. The servants who cleaned the floor had found a small hairpin tucked near the corner of the couch, but they returned it to the shelf without question. The Pharaoh's sandals were cleaned more often now, polished with oil, buffed at the edges. But they were never set near the girl's old place. The brothers remained at the door. One of them grew older, slower. His joints began to ache in the morning, but he never spoke of retirement. The other, quiet as ever, took on more of the night shift. And sometimes, when the moon was high, he thought he heard a step. Just one. A faint footfall, uneven. But he would never turn to look. Some sandals, after all, were not meant to be seen. Now the halls are quieter. You are somewhere near their center, neither in the Pharaoh's chamber nor the servant wing. Somewhere between. A soft place where footfalls vanish, and the air hums with what was never written down. Let your thoughts become light. Let your sandals rest at the door, and sleep. The sandal never reappeared. Not in the hallway, not tucked into the linen baskets, not swept out with the morning dust by servants who bent low with palm brooms. It was simply gone, like a breath that slips between words, like a name never written. In the weeks that followed, the palace returned to its rhythm. Offerings continued at dawn. Priests chanted their songs to the Aten. The queen's attendants whispered about hair oils and embroidered collars. The guards still stood at their posts, their eyes level and forward, their mouths still, and the Pharaoh's door stayed shut a little longer in the mornings. Inside, he moved slower. He still prayed, always to the Aten, always with open palms. But something in his face had changed. The scribes who recorded his movements began writing shorter entries. Pharaoh retired early. Pharaoh walked alone through West Garden. Pharaoh did not speak during second offering. No one asked why. No one ever did. The sandal had never belonged to a queen, never to a noble's daughter. It had no gold thread, no stamp of ownership, no carved symbol, but the absence it left behind had weight. The Pharaoh's sleeping chamber, once gently perfumed by fig oil and cooled by quiet steps, now held the stillness of distance. He never spoke of the girl, not to the priests, not to the queen, not even, it seemed, to the gods. But one evening, he lingered by the doorway, just for a moment, before stepping inside, and the younger of the two guards, watching without turning his head, saw the Pharaoh glance downward, as if expecting to see something that wasn't there. He didn't pause long. He simply exhaled, and stepped over the space where the sandal had once rested. That night, the torches in the outer hall burned lower than usual. The air smelled of sandalwood. No one knew who placed the stick of incense in the nearby tray. It wasn't part of the schedule. The scent drifted lightly, not strong enough to draw attention, just enough to remind someone, anyone, that something soft had once walked through this place. Years passed. The guards changed. New faces took their place along the corridor, their hands steadier than their stories. The old guards, the two brothers, had moved on, one to the temple, the other to the records house near the river. And once, during a flood season, when the lower archive flooded and scrolls were moved upstairs, the younger brother passed a painted panel he hadn't seen in decades. It showed the Pharaoh in profile, his eyes large, his hands lifted toward the sun disk, and at the edge of the panel, just barely carved into the corner, was the figure of a servant woman, unnamed, unpainted, but clearly drawn, standing slightly behind the Pharaoh, her posture quiet, her feet bare. She wore no crown. She held no scroll, but one foot stepped just slightly forward, just enough to see the curve of her heel. The brother didn't speak. He only nodded once. That was how remembering worked in the palace. Softly, not loudly like kings, but quietly, like sandals left behind. Back in the present, where your pillow cradles your thoughts and the night has grown thicker, you are no longer in Akhenaten. You are in a hallway of sleep now, a soft, slow corridor where nothing clinks, where no one turns to look, and where silence wears sandals of its own. Let your eyes close fully now. Let the air grow still. Whatever was meant to be remembered has walked with you far enough. Let it rest and sleep.